Welcome everybody to the latest LLC integration panel. Today we're going to be talking about inequality in 2020. Let me introduce myself to those of you who are not in my class. My name is Alan Jin. I'm an economics professor in the School of Business. I teach principles of microeconomics. That's my LLC. That's my LLC course. Okay, and the others will introduce themselves, I think, at the appropriate time. And so let me share this little presentation that I have here then. And so let's see, how do we do this? Okay. So I'm going to talk about inequality from an economic perspective. Okay. And so the title of my presentation is Economic Inequality then in 2020. Okay. The first thing I want to talk about is how do economists measure inequality? Economists are pretty quantitative, and we like then to put numbers on things, and we have come up then with a measure of inequality that we call then the Gini coefficient. This looks complicated, but let me explain it here then. This red line right here is perfect equality. So you see on the horizontal axis, we have the percentage of the population. On the vertical axis, we have the percentage of income. So if 25% of the population earn 25% of the income, that's that point right there. If 75% of the population earns 75% of the income, that is that point then right there. So this straight line again represents perfect equality. Everybody has the same amount, then of money. Okay, but let's suppose that 25% of the people earn less, maybe like 5%. So that would give you a point then like that right there. And so anything below this point means that people are making less than the percentage that they represent as far as the population is concerned. And so the Gini coefficient then is this area here, A, divided by the sum of A plus B. Okay. And the key thing about the Gini coefficient is that as income inequality grows, as income inequality grows, people make less than their percentage, this A section gets bigger. For example, you'd be down here, for example, if 50% are earned a smaller amount then of money. So A would get bigger. That means this whole fraction gets bigger. The bottom line is the higher the Gini coefficient, the more is income inequality. Okay, so what does income inequality look like? Let's see, it's not moving here. Oh, okay, there we go. What does income inequality look like in the US? So this is what the Gini coefficient in the US look like. And so you see then that way back in the 1960s, we were below 40% in terms of this Gini coefficient. But you see that it's been steadily rising ever since. So in 1918, the latest, or 2018, the latest year for which we have data, we're almost then at 0.49 as far as this Gini coefficient then is concerned. So it's risen considerably since the 1960s. So we've had a greater inequality then as far as income is concerned. Okay, this shows you the Gini coefficient then broken down by country. Okay, by country. So you see then that the green represents lower levels, the red represents higher levels. Okay, and this time instead of a decimal, it's expressed as a percentage here. So you see then that the countries with the most equality, the green ones, then tend to be Europe here, Australia, and we have Canada then over here, some parts of Africa, and India then as well. Okay, if you're a cynic, you'd say that, well, in some of those countries, that means everybody's poor. Okay, everybody's poor. But again, if you look at the countries that are normally considered in the industrialized categories, then we have Japan over here, we got Europe, we got again Australia and Canada. They tend to have then higher levels of equality. Okay, they have less inequality. Okay, again, then then the darker the red that you get, the more inequality you have. Actually, the most unequal country in the world is actually South Africa. Notice that here we're in the U.S. We're in the pink. The U.S. ranks 107th in the world out of 159 countries. We are between Argentina and Côte d'Ivoire in Africa in terms of where we rank in internationally. So why has there been increased inequality then over time? Number of reasons here. Number one, there's been a decline in manufacturing employment. Okay, manufacturing employment played a big role in the US economy because those jobs tended to be pretty good paying jobs. They were usually unionized, and the unions were able then to get higher wages, and they were able to get benefit packages then as well. And as a result, that was a way for people then to move into the middle class. Even if you didn't go to college, if you're just a high school graduate, again, you can get a job then in a manufacturing assembly line and earn a pretty good middle class living. We've had a decline though in that manufacturing employment. One reason is globalization. Okay, a lot of the jobs in manufacturing in the US have moved in overseas. A big part though is automation and technology. I don't know if anybody is here from engineering, but a lot of things like robotics and things like that have replaced workers. And as a result, you don't need as many workers then to produce as much output. And there's also been a decline in unionization. That did not cause a decline in manufacturing employment, but again, this has resulted in a situation where workers have less power, and as a result of that, wages have not increased as rapidly as they had previously. Okay, so decline in manufacturing employment is one reason for increased inequality. The second one is the STEM divide. There's been a greater premium as far as education is concerned. So if you have a college education now that is worth more than it has been in the past, particularly if you're in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math. And there's a big inequality then in terms of STEM education in the U.S. Some schools then are a lot better at it than others. For example, I live in northern San Diego County, and the schools up here are pretty good, and they have very strong science programs. There's an annual science competition where the northern schools dominate. And so I tried to start a program where we bring USD students to some of the poorer schools in the southern part of the county and tried to help coach them then to compete in that competition. But again, more money then if you have a higher education. Okay, an unequal expansion in wealth. Okay, there's been an unequal expansion then as far as wealth is concerned. Now wealth is different from income. Wealth is the assets that you have, and we'll see in a bit what impact that has. But there have been big gains in the stock market. The stock market has just boomed in the last few decades, and housing prices have also surged, particularly in coastal areas. And then there's just huge rewards then as far as finance is concerned, just huge amounts of money then being made then in the finance area. Okay, and so this is kind of reflected if you take a look then at the Gini coefficient then by state in the US. So you see here that the more purple you get, that is a higher Gini index, or a greater amount then of inequality. And the lighter blue you get then, the more equality then that you get. And so you see then that we have most of the South in the purple category, but then we also have California, Illinois, and New York, this whole sector then in there. And I attribute this then to finance. Again, there are big finance centers then in this area. And then California, also high tech is helpful then in terms of explaining then this distribution. This chart here shows you then the breakdown, the ranking then by state. So for those of you who are not from California, pick out where your state is as far as the ranking in terms of inequality is concerned. You see that New York is the most unequal state. And again, that's the financial center. That's the financial center then of the country. And so those big gains, the people then in finance means that a lot of income go to a few people. Connecticut is just nearby. So a lot of people in Connecticut work in New York in the finance area. Here we are in California, we're in the number four slot. Massachusetts, probably high tech then as far as that is concerned. So again, an odd mixture then of some of the bigger states where you got finance and technology are important, and then some of these rural southern states like Alabama and Arkansas, Mississippi, then like that. You can see that if you take a look at this chart here. This chart, somebody went and did this by county. So each one of these little blocks in here represents a county. And so here we are in San Diego, down here in the southwest part then of the country. We're kind of in this second category here in terms of the Gini coefficient. But again, you see that in big swaths of the rural South, in the Rio Grande Valley here in Texas, parts of New Mexico here, and Appalachia as well. Again, those are rural areas with the high amounts of poverty. And again, you'll have a lot of income inequality in those areas. But also then it's harder to see because these are just concentrated cities, but you've got New York here, you've got the Bay Area, where again, you've got both finance and you've got technology. Then there's Los Angeles, there's then in terms of a dark situation there then, okay? Let's take a look at the impact of wealth inequality here. Wealth inequality. Let me ask you to imagine the following situation. Let's suppose that person A has $100,000 invested in the stock market at a 7% annual return, whereas person B has 0. Okay, so again, wealth is the amount of assets then that you have. A has some assets, B doesn't have any assets then. Okay, if they both made the same amount of money, then at the end of 30 years, A will have $760,000 more than B. Okay, again, they earn exactly the same amount of money. A just had $100,000 to begin with. At the end of 30 years, at 7% annual return, A then will have more than $750,000 more than B. Okay, B then would need to earn about $7,500 more per year than A, just to be even in terms of wealth then at the end of 30 years, okay? So what does the median net worth look like in terms of different groups? You see here, this is the division then by racial groups. You see white is 171,000, African American below 20,000, Hispanic slightly over 20,000. This other category includes Asians and Native Americans, about 65,000 as far as that's concerned. So not all of that is in the stock market. Some of that is in the value of a residential home, but again, the same principle then kind of applies then in that situation, okay? Let's take a look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic here. The economic impact, the impact of the pandemic has been uneven. It's hurt some people more than others. So the job losses are largely in the lower wage service type of jobs, leisure and hospitality, those are the restaurants, hotels, amusement parks, things like that. And then in services, you know, the haircutting places, gyms, yoga studios, things like that, and retailing. So that's where a lot of the jobs have been lost. Those jobs require face-to-face contact that have been affected in by this pandemic. Okay. What happened here? My next slide won't go down. Okay, the jobs at the high end are more conducive to remote working. You know, like we're doing now. You know, you could do finance through Zoom. You could maybe do some engineering and chemistry and other things, publishing through Zoom as well, or other avenues. So again, those that require face-to-face contact or person-to-person contact, and so those have held up better then. There's a greater prevalence of the disease in communities of color, and that shows that there's a disparity in healthcare and health issues. More pollution, in terms of those communities. Access to food, not as good. There are what are called food deserts, and higher density living. Okay, more people living in apartments and so on. Okay, and some people then are calling this a she session as opposed to a re session. Why? Women are particularly impacted by the job losses. Again, if you take a look at some of these jobs here in leisure and hospitality, the restaurants, the hotels, things like that, the services, again, they are, a lot of them are disproportionately staffed in by women. And then women also have childcare, have more childcare and education responsibilities. So a lot more women than men have had to drop out of the labor force as a result then of the pandemic. Let me conclude then with some policies then to deal with inequality. In the US, we use these first two as the primary means then, a progressive income tax system. That means the tax rate increases as your income increases. So as your income goes up, you pay a higher percentage then of each extra dollar that you make then in the form of taxes. And there's an argument, there's a political argument about how high then that should go. There's also then on the other side, aid to low-income individuals in the form of food through the SNAP program, supplemental nutrition assistance program, medical care through Medicaid, and then low-income housing as well. There's very little cash payment to low-income people then these days. But other policies to deal with inequality. Remember, we mentioned the STEM divide. Improving education system in poor communities. There's a big disparity in terms of education quality then between communities, and that includes then increased access to higher education. So that's why we have student aid, financial aid then sometimes based on need. Okay, reduce segregation. There's actually a higher degree of segregation these days in some communities where the wealthy tend to live near one another and the poor tend to live near one another. And there's some problems. There's a problem then with that segregation. And then finally, one thing that I'll mention as a question mark that some people are talking about, something called a universal basic income. That means that everybody should get a set amount of money then every year as a kind of a guaranteed income. The presidential candidate Andrew Yang was a big advocate then as far as that is concerned. And so there are some people on both sides of the political spectrum, both conservatives and liberals then that find that an interesting concept. Okay, and so that was my presentation then, dealing with inequality then from an economic perspective. Okay, and I'll answer questions then later on towards the end. Okay, thank you.
That was great.
You're done?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I was just having a dog barking in the background. All right, so Eleanor, would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first? Or
I'm happy to go. I will jump up. Let's see, Alan, I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
If that's all right. All right, so hi folks. So my name is Eleanor Gillette, and I'm in the chemistry department here. And so you may be thinking, what's a chemist doing coming to talk about inequality? This seems a little bit out of our lane, right? But what I want to tell you, I want to tell you a story about a sort of a specific instance or a specific example of inequality that continues to persist in the US right now. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in Flint, Michigan, but not just in Flint, right? In actually lots and lots of other places in the US where there is water that is potentially not safe to drink. I want to sort of kick this off by acknowledging sort of the bigger picture challenge here, right? I am going to talk about a very specific situation that happened in the US and that has happened in many large American cities. But I think it's important to acknowledge that when we think about water quality, as Americans, we are very privileged, right? Of the more than 2 billion people globally who don't have access to clean water right now, many of them are not Americans, right? Many of these are folks who don't have basic drinking water services at all, let alone basic drinking water services that are not safe. That being said, among our peers in what the Yale Economic Center for Environmental Law considers the global West, right? Among countries with comparable wealth to us, we do very poorly relative to our peers in basically all of our environmental management areas, right? In terms of waste management, in terms of exposure to heavy metals, and in terms of sanitation and drinking water. Although we do better than the global average, we consistently perform lower than the average that would be predicted based on our sort of GDP as a country. And within the United States, there are a handful of very serious challenges that people still face. So somewhere upwards of 1.5 million Americans as of the last major nationwide data collection that was published back in 2012, there was still more than 1.5 million Americans who lacked access to indoor water at all. Of those of us who perhaps live in rural areas outside of community water systems, with community treatment systems, domestic wells, if you get your water from domestic wells, something like 1/4 of them have at least one contaminant that exceeds what the EPA would recommend as safe. And unfortunately, a boom in fracking has made probably that statistic worse over the last decade, not better. But the topic I'm going to talk to you about specifically today is neither of those issues, although they're very important, but is the 30 million Americans who receive their water from a municipal water service, right? Something like San Diego Water. 30 million Americans served by community water systems that have been in violation of the EPA's lead and copper rules. Of those systems, we think that at least 5.5 million people have been exposed to high lead levels within that time period between 2015 and 2018. And so this is a widespread problem, right? You've heard about it in Flint, but these water systems which have exceeded this 15 parts per billion action level are spread all over the country. So these are places with clean treated water coming out of the taps that exceed what the EPA considers not just unsafe, but to be actionable. So there is no safe level of lead, especially for children, but the EPA only requires action at levels above 15 parts per billion. So how does this happen? How do we have these sophisticated water treatment systems in this country and still have large regions where the water is not safe? So when you think about lead, right, somebody talks to you about, oh, a lead pipe, right? Mr. Mustard in the parlor with the lead pipe. Lead isn't very soluble, right? It's a solid piece of metal. We've been making pipes out of it, right? The Romans were the first to use it for drinking water pipes. So it's not very soluble in water. In and of itself, as a metal, it's not very dangerous. To get into your body, to get into the water and to get into your body, it needs to be oxidized, right? So that's really a fancy chemistry way of saying it needs to rust, right? And so we go from metallic solid lead to some type of oxidized lead, to this lead ion. Luckily, even oxidized lead is not actually very soluble in a lot of its forms. But some of them are soluble, and this is where the problem comes up. So anybody who's taking chemistry right now or took it back in high school maybe remembers having to memorize one of these charts about the solubility of ions, right? It's one of those really tedious things that your teacher or professor might have made you do. But if we look at one of these charts and we look at things that are soluble with lead, we find, okay, lots of things, fluoride in the water, not a problem, right? Sulfate in the water, not a problem. Phosphate, not a problem. But there are a handful of combinations, lead and chlorate, lead and nitrates, which are quite soluble. So the goal in any municipal water system is to make these soluble salts less likely to form, make as much of the insoluble ones as you can. And so this is genuinely how your city water system manages lead. There's lead in service lines, there's lead in fixtures, there's lead all throughout the distribution system. It's expensive to replace, it's expensive to find. So rather than replacing all of the toxic lead components, we add things to the water to keep the lead from dissolving, right? So at its core, this is a chemistry problem. This is a chemistry solubility problem. And so part of what they do at your city water plant is work with the water system to keep these soluble lead salts from forming. Except obviously, it doesn't always work. So what went wrong in Flint? So back in 2014 in Flint, Michigan, the city was in the middle of a financial crisis. The city was being administered by an emergency manager. They had not been allowed to elect their own mayor. The financial situation was bad enough that the state had stepped in. And at the time, they were paying the city of Detroit for treated water. And they had decided that they could save money on that contract by switching to local water, switching to a local water source that they would not have to pay the city of Detroit for. When they switched to the Flint River water, instead of the water they were receiving from the city of Detroit, they did not have an adequate corrosion control plan in place. There wasn't a lot of money, there wasn't a lot of expertise in this small suburb of Detroit. And they felt like they needed to do this in a hurry, right? Detroit, the city of Detroit actually goes bankrupt shortly after this. The cities are in a lot of trouble. So they make this switch under basically duress, right? In the middle of a recession, tax revenues are down, but they didn't have the technical expertise in place to manage this water. Very early on, they start seeing problems. So the first thing that happens is bacterial levels spike, and you start getting bacterial readings in the water. They issue boil water advisories, and local manufacturers start to realize that the water is very corrosive. So there's a General Motors plant that stops using the city water almost immediately. But nobody in the city government puts two and two together on these issues. At this point, people in town start turning on their taps and seeing this awful brown color, right? So it takes quite some time before the residents and the local businesses are able to convince the city that there is a problem. And not only does it take a long time, it actually takes outside scientists, both some folks from Virginia Tech University and some folks from Wayne State in Detroit, to come in and do some external testing to prove to the city that there is a problem here. So it's more than a year later when they finally admit there's a problem, they switch back to Detroit water. The problem is that that coating of insoluble lead that was on the inside of the pipes is gone. And it's going to take years to get it back. And so we have years potentially where there will be excess lead in the water in this city because they essentially tried to take a shortcut to provide their community with clean water. So when you think about this, you think, okay, this sounds like a terrible accident, right? But it's just one incident, except that it's not, right? So not only has it happened before, so Washington, D.C. in the early 2000s had almost the exact same problem. They compounded the problem by requiring that city residents should cover part of the cost of replacing lead-containing lines to their own houses, leaving low-income communities in a bind. So then Flint happens in 2014 and 2015. You would think, again, that we've learned our lesson. But 2 years later, Newark, New Jersey has almost the same problem. An aging water treatment facility, an inadequate corrosion control plan leads to massive problems. They have switched to a better corrosion control plan, but again, just like in Flint, it may take months or years to repair the damage that has been done. Now, again, you say, okay, right, these are mistakes. These are technical problems. They're chemistry issues. Water chemistry is complicated, and you're right. But I would argue that we also should consider the communities that this has impacted. So these are results from a very long-term study by the CDC about lead levels in children between the ages of 1 and 5. And these are lead levels recorded in their blood. The black bars are the average levels. The red bars are the disaggregated data for just the Black children. The gray bars are the white and Hispanic children. No matter what variable you try to control for here, we see our Black neighbors being disproportionately impacted by lead, right? And this is lead in children's blood. This is not just lead that we measure in the water, right? This is people that it is having an impact on. This is a problem that's bigger than chemistry, right? We need to understand the water chemistry. We need to understand what we can do, but we also need to understand why our choices are disproportionately impacting some of our community more than others. So I do want to wrap up here with a little bit of a pitch. None of you are in my LLC class right now, right? Because I'm not teaching an LLC class this fall, but I will be teaching in the spring. And so if you're interested and excited about how chemistry might help us understand these kinds of real problems, might help us help our neighbors, please consider taking Chem 152 as your LLC course so that we will have lots of opportunities to talk more about these kinds of issues. All right, that's what I've got for you.
Great. I guess I'll go ahead and start. Good evening. My name is Tim Randall, and I teach first-year writing in the LLC Collaborate theme. The title of my talk is Inequality in the Age of Truthiness. Truthiness is a word that was coined by Stephen Colbert, a talk show host, on October 17, 2005, on his then show, The Colbert Report. The definition of truthiness is the belief or assertion that a particular statement is true based on the intuition or perceptions of people, without regard to evidence, logic, intellectual examination, or facts. Truthiness can include falsehoods, deceit, or propaganda intended to persuade. Truthiness is an important word because it captures the loss of certainty in a politically polarized culture in which both sides accuse the other of dealing in lies, deception, and half-truths. The word truthiness so much captured political divides in the United States that it was named Word of the Year for 2006 by Merriam-Webster Dictionary. The word is also important because it calls into question. If something has the feel of truth but is not true, what is truth? And how do we determine it? The course I teach in the LLCs is related to this question. In first year writing, I teach that everything humanity makes is an argument. That is true of a news or opinion article. It's true of a poem. It's true of the architecture of a building, the clothes a person wears, a photograph, a film, and so on. A text can be written in any discourse, in biology, philosophy, political economy, poetry, sociology, and so on. So part of what I teach in first year writing is learning how to persuade and how to read persuasive arguments, whether the arguments are explicit, so you know someone is arguing something, or whether they're just implied, suggested. So the discipline I teach includes rhetoric. Rhetoric means the art of persuasion. But if everybody is persuading, if everything is an argument, if we're trying to persuade others in writing, what is the content? What are we trying to persuade others of? What should we take to be a good argument? My course includes as its subject matter not only what makes writing good in its search for truth, but also what makes the writing good in its aim to persuade. We study the rhetorical appeals of logos, or the logic of an argument, the rhetorical appeal of ethos, or the credibility of the argument or the person making the argument, and the pathos appeal, that is the emotional appeal of the argument. All of these types of appeals aim to win our allegiance. We look for something to be logical. We want to think we can believe the person making an argument. We want to trust our emotions, whether we are being made angry or sad by a discourse. Are we angry at the right people? Or does the TV newsman just work for corporations that want to trick us? In other words, is there any truth with a capital T that can be found in an argument? This question is important for figuring out if we should work for equality or just for ourselves. Sometimes we have competing discourses. Some people tell you, work hard, rise by merit, you earned it. Then someone will tell you, those people didn't work hard, they don't deserve it, and you shouldn't have to help pay for what they didn't achieve on their own, and so on. So we have to determine what equality means to us, each one of us. So this question of truth with a capital T, can we find the basis of equality in something true? This is an old question, and it takes us back to the history of philosophy, back to Plato and Aristotle. Plato, for example, argued that there is such a thing as truth. That is, truth with a capital T. Not a relative truth, whereby we each have our own points of view, but an absolute truth in which there is an essential meaning that cannot be denied. Plato embeds this notion in his concept of ideal forms, the idea that everything we see in the world is an imperfect copy of something that exists on another plane of existence. Any chair you happen to be sitting on right now is an imperfect copy of an ideal perfect chair. Any woman you see is an imperfect copy of an ideal woman. And the imperfect woman would be happier to go through life trying to emulate the perfect ideal woman. Plato's concept of truth already starts to raise issues concerning equality. Who has access to this perfect plane of existence? Who gets to decide what, perfect woman exists there? In Plato's time, men decided these things, and women were considered chattel, that is, property of men. Nowadays, we live in what we call the postmodern age, which assumes that there is no absolute disinterested essence of truth that resides in objects or that we can perceive. So it's very different from Plato's time. Postmodernism works on the assumption that truth does not have a capital T. We only have truth with a small t, a relative truth. What is true for you might not be true for me. It can be a frightening concept. Postmodernism assumes that all truths are interested. That is, they get someone something. They are created in language, which is a tool used by power to get other people to serve power's interests. Might, in a sense, can pass itself off as necessary and right. This can lead to a world filled with inequality, a world that has been made from the start from inequality. And with everyone struggling for power, whether that is, the more equal power of equality or the less equal power of dominance, how do we know what to do and who do we believe? You might wonder if the LLCs are about learning how different disciplines approach similar concerns. Don't any of them have the ability to reach some truth? Isn't, for example, science a discourse that reaches truths that we can rely on? The answer is yes. Each discipline can find a kind of truth, but it is a truth with a small t. Science itself is an interested discourse, which is not the way many people perceive it, popularly. That is, it's a way of talking about reality. It has values, aims, and assumptions that operate in language. For example, if I want to find the element gold, I first have to name it in a category using language. When I look through a microscope, I have an interested point of view. I'm looking for gold. I use language to divide the gold from the other stuff connected to it, which I might, because I don't care about it, I'll say it's just worthless, it's dross, it's nothing, right? The rise of empiricism is the rise of a powerful and rigorous point of view that uses objective impersonal categories that the communities that use science try to agree on. And it creates these categories for its own interested ends, whether it's this science or that science, right? Whether it's physics or biology and so on. Sometimes we might see science as serving all of us. It serves humanity. Sometimes we might see science as a rival to other discourses. Some think it rivals religion, and some don't think it rivals religion. So truthiness, which fills our world, can sometimes undermine our ability to know what to do or what cause to fight for or what to believe. Should we listen to 99.9% of scientists who say climate change is man-made and we need to start reversing it, or we will wipe ourselves off the planet? Or should we listen to people, perhaps people who are on the side of corporations, that say we just don't know for sure will they continue to produce and burn fossil fuels? Which side should we take? In the resulting confusion, many people give up. And sometimes that is the whole point of truthiness. Those who wish to confuse you hope you will also give up. Hope they will, they hope that you will join them. Perhaps that's because that's perhaps where the wealth is, where the power is, where it's safe. Unlike Plato, I understand any human-made object to be a text that does something in the world based on needs, values, and assumptions. The text will have a main point and supporting points, methods of support for its argument, an immediate and perhaps long-term purpose within its rhetorical context, and an attitude towards the subject matter. And it will have a target audience. Different audiences might receive the argument differently. Understanding reality as a text helps us determine what side to take, and that is very important. You don't want to be someone's chump, but in a capitalist society in which the culture talks equality, but the economic system has created the greatest gap between rich and poor in the nation's history, how do you know what to do? Do you feel poverty by do you fuel poverty by collaborating with power, taking on the interests of the upper class and giving charity on a Sunday? You adopt a slogan similar to Google's "Don't be evil" or "Do no evil." You know, if only we could determine what is good and what is evil in a world filled with divisions. And so I'm asking the question, can we? Well, I have kind of an answer for you, but it doesn't involve the words good or evil. I suggest you look at every argument, every policy, and evaluate it as a rhetorician. And that means many of the policies we've heard talked about today. What do you do about the problems of contaminated water in Flint? And speaking of Flint, Michael Moore made a film called Roger and Me about, what responsibility do the General Motors have to Flint, the city, when it pulled out all of its, most of its factories to build factories in other countries and so on. Were they right to do that? So these are questions that involve just about everything that's been talked about tonight, including some of the things that Professor Jin talked about. And he showed us that world map and showed us all the different levels of equality around the world when he attributed the rise in the gap between wealth and poor to the decline of unions, which had a history of fighting corporate interests to share more of the wealth among the people. So these are the types of questions that we need to look at. So I suggest you look at every argument, every policy, and evaluate it as a rhetorician. You have to ask yourself 4 questions. And if you ask these 4 questions, if you really try to find what you believe to be the right answer, and if you practice doing this every time you read the news or have a conversation, you might learn something. So my 4 questions may at first seem selfish because they're all about self-interest, which means that I'm not talking about symbols. I'm not talking about things like patriotism and intangible things. I'm not talking about the types of things that some people might consider sacred and so on. I think sometimes it helps to start with the material and build your way up to the symbolic. So here are the 4 questions I suggest you ask yourself. Is this argument in my short-term self-interest? That is, do I get something out of this if I go along with this argument, whether it's to have school vouchers or to cut or raise taxes and so on? Is this in my self-interest? Am I going to get something out of this? And then the second question I think you should ask is this in my immediate collective self-interest? Collective, not just you, not just individually, but there are other people like you, other people of your class, other people who perhaps share your race or ethnicity, other people who perhaps share your gender or your sexual orientation, because people will be talking about all sorts of policies, all sorts of laws that will be made. Then you have to figure out, what is my stake in this, not just as an individual, but for all the different identities that I might inhabit. And you may look at those categories, very, very broadly or more specifically. Perhaps you don't share the sexual orientation of a particular person or group, but you have a sexual orientation, and do you think that that orientation should be, alienated or given less rights and so on? So you have to look at those immediate collective self-interests. But then you also have to think in the long term, and that's question 3. Is this in my long-term self-interest? And then finally, is this in my long-term collective self-interest? So for example, if somebody wants to give you and also the super rich a tax cut, you might say, yes, I needed that money. That's great. Christmas is coming up. I'd like to do some shopping. And it might seem it's really in your self-interest. Okay, you want to get that check immediately. If someone is giving those tax cuts to a lot of people like you might think, great, it's in my collective self-interest. We're all getting checks this year. But is this in your long-term self-interest? Maybe your tax cuts will expire after 4 years, but the tax cuts for the super rich will not expire for 10 years. Did you look into that? Did they tell you that when they were talking about tax cuts? So maybe it's not really in your long-term self-interest. Maybe you traded your $1,200 that you got over 4 years so that corporations could pay, let's say 17% instead of 33% of their wealth for 10 years. That could add up to trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that don't go into the public coffers. So is that good for you in the long run? Is that good for everyone in your economic class in the long run? A few years later, perhaps we won't have health care because, well, we just can't afford it. We can't have Social Security because, well, we just can't afford it. We can't have any social safety net for people because, well, we just can't afford it. Meanwhile, the value of all commodities is created by labor, by people like you who create those things, those services. But the wealth is flowing up to bosses who get tax cuts. But the news might tell you that you don't want big government, that taxes are bad, that you deserve to eat while others can't because you earned your food, that people who escape brutality from other countries should be jailed because they might take your job, and you don't make enough money as it is anyway. In short, the world will be filled with arguments that divide you from others. They will not ask you to think about your collective self-interest in the short term or the long term. They might try to get you to think just about you. And when you hear these arguments, they might sound very sensible. They're suggesting you're going to get something. And that might undermine your understanding that you have collective interests as well as individual interests. So the last thing I'd want to leave you with is, how many identities do you have? When we talk about self-interest, that is, how many bridges can you build with other people to see their interest as yours? You have a common stake in letting other people enjoy the same rights and freedoms that you do? Do you have a stake in those who are mistreated because of their race, with those who are excluded due to their sexual orientation, those who are hungry because they were born in a class lower than yours? You may find that there are many kinds of identity in you, race, sex, class, gendered, and so on. And you may find that, therefore, your collective interests make it imperative to learn how to deconstruct the interested arguments all around you, and to make the education, that is the ability to read such arguments, available to everyone. Because in a divided society, those who are in it together work together and make a better world for everyone. And I think many of the things that we saw in our two other presentations today could be talked about in those terms, including, for example, Professor Jin was talking about STEM education, creating a gap between rich and poor. And I'm suggesting something similar, but for me, it's an education in rhetoric, reading and writing, and the ability to understand issues and see through the truthiness that is all around us. Thank you.
We're towards the end here. Does anybody have any questions? Doesn't sound like it. I'll just ask one day, Eleanor. Eleanor, do students have to take Chem 151 to get into Chem 152?
Unfortunately, yes. So you will have needed to take 151, but for anybody who has taken 151, come take 152 with me. It'll be a good time.
see something in the chat here. Is that no questions? Okay. I think that's about it then. Thanks everybody for coming, and hope you got something out of this. Have a good rest of your evening then.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I like Anne Marie's comment. All the speeches were great. I won't drink water of the tap anymore.
See, I wish we'd had a little more time, because actually your point is sort of ideal there, right? It's not that we shouldn't drink the water. It's that we're all in this together, right? We all should want our water systems to be paid for by the rich, by all of the communities, right? That it's when your wealthy communities split off from their neighbors and
Right.
say, oh, we don't have to help you guys out, that
Right.
you run into this problem.
So if you'll say I buy my water in a bottle and, so stop drinking it out of the tap, and then we're divided again, right?
and right, and then the plastic ends up in the ocean, and there's a whole nother set of environmental consequences that come from the lack of trust in these systems.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Laura, I